Recording in progress.
So welcome everybody that's here. I'm sure we'll have a few more people joining us in the next couple of minutes. We're very grateful to have you here this afternoon, and especially, of course, to our speakers that I'll be introducing soon. I want to also, at the front end, thank our virtual talk sponsor for this year, which is Montecito Bank and Trust. So thank you guys so much for helping us be able to do and offer these talks. This is the second of 3 virtual discussions that are connected to our biomass exhibition, which does close on Labor Day weekend. So there's only a couple of weekends left to go. And then next week on Wednesday will be the 3rd and final talk of this series. And that one will be featuring artists Summer Roman and Maria Rendon. So do go to our website and sign up if you'd like to join us for that one. Before I introduce our speakers, just a couple of other announcements. This Sunday afternoon, we're holding a free open house from 2 to 6. It's going to be a very fun afternoon. There are going to be several artists from 2 of our different exhibitions that will be here in attendance to chat with our visitors. For the first time ever, I'm excited that we have a food truck in the back parking lot. So bring your appetite as well. They're going to be serving a variety of sliders and other things. And it'll be outside, so it'll be very safe, and we'll have some outdoor seating for that as well. We are going to have a princess visit by Parties and Paint by Kate, and rumor has it that the Little Mermaid will be joining us for a couple of those hours and meeting with our young visitors. And we are also going to have representatives from Healthy People, Healthy Trails who are involved in our Art from Trail exhibition on our 2nd floor. So they'll be there to chat with folks. Of course, we're requiring masks. We are in Santa Barbara County, and that is required for indoors, and we'll be monitoring the crowd. So I think it's going to be a really safe and fun visit, and we hope to see you. After biomass comes down, and we're going to be very busy, Lauren and I, in September, and all of the other folks that are going to be helping us, we'll be installing Sharing the Light, Ansel Adams and Alan Ross, and that will actually be opening on September 25th. And Alan Ross was Ansel's exclusive darkroom assistant, and is exclusively the person who reproduces and through darkroom work, Ansel's special Yosemite prints. And he's a fantastic photographer in his own right. This is going to be a really, really beautiful show. So hopefully get that on your calendar, and we will see you this fall for that. With that, let's meet the artists who are here today and here to share about their work and their process. We're going to start with Dorothy Churchill-Johnson, and then I'll introduce Scott Chatenever before his presentation. And then if you have questions, I said this earlier, but if you're just now joining us, we do have a Q&A area. You can type your questions in there, or you're welcome to pop them into the chat. Lauren will help keep an eye on everything. If it seems germane to what the artist is talking about in that moment, we'll just kind of hit the pause button and bring up the question then. Otherwise, we'll hold the question until the end of their presentation. So with that, I'm very happy and excited to introduce Dorothy Churchill-Johnson. Dorothy is a graduate of the University of Massachusetts. She has been working as an artist in Santa Barbara since 1976. She's known for very large-sized contemporary realist oils on canvas, and she synthesizes hard-edged realism with other influences like pattern decor, neo-pop, abstraction. And she's really focused on finding beauty in the ordinary details of our everyday surroundings, and then really blowing them up to visual extremes through color and size. And she hopes that the viewer sees them kind of afresh in this new showing that she does. Her work has been collected by museums, major corporations, 5-star hotels, hospitals, and lots of private collectors nationally and beyond. And she recently exhibited a retrospective of her work at the Butler Institute of American Art in Ohio earlier this year. So with that, welcome, Dorothy, and we're excited to have you share about your work.
Thank you.
You did all my bragging for me, so I won't have to say anything. I did want to thank Holly Harmon and Nicole Strasberg for curating such a gorgeous show and for thinking of me to participate in it. I'm really honored to be in such a fantastic show. Do you have a slide to show? I'm not seeing any slides.
Stacey, you're muted. The screen is being shared, Dorothy, so we have it visible.
I'm not seeing any slides. Are you? Where's the PowerPoint? Where are the slides?
Okay, so if you look at the top right-hand corner of your screen, there should be a view button. And if you have it on standard view, it should be showing the screen share right now. What kind of screen are you seeing at the moment?
It says standard. What I'm looking for on my PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same, just the introductory.
Yeah, right now.
There we go.
Okay, yeah, we're just, yeah, so you'll just want to say next slide for us to change.
Yes.
Sorry, I thought you weren't seeing it at all, but we're good.
Okay. These two I just included for a view of my studio. And also on the right, the painting is just to indicate the size of most of my work, or some of my work, so that when you're looking at the small image, you'll realize that it's a pretty big labor-intensive piece. Next slide. This is an example of earlier work. When I graduated from the university, I would have been left out of class if I had tried to do anything representational. Abstraction was king. So it took me a while to figure out, to have my aha moment about what I wanted to say, because I knew I had nothing to add in the world of abstraction, and realism was, for me, where meaning is. So my aha moment was discovering that I could look closely at nature and at details, cracks in the sidewalk, pattern in fabrics. By looking absolutely closely at everything, I could magnify it and show people the everyday details that they're not seeing, so that I could show them at visual extremes and make people feel that they're seeing something familiar for the first time. This was all done with a fine point pen, and even the pine needles are all drawn in individually, and the lichen on the log. Next slide. Here are two more examples of pen and ink work. I started out with a crow quill pen, and then, of course, graduated to rapidograph fine point. And all the darks and lights are put in with cross hatching. The one on the left shows a natural pattern with a man-made pattern. And well, the one on the right is fairly self-explanatory, the patterns of everything. Next. Cracks in the sidewalk have always interested me. The fact that even man-made intrusions like pavement can't stop the natural plants from breaking through. This was when I switched to oil painting, because Ivan Karp, who was one of the most famous dealers in New York, I showed him my drawings, and he said to me, if you want to make money in this business, you have to paint oil on canvas. So it took me a while to get around to it, but then I started painting. This is an example of, finding beauty in ordinary things, looking closely at everything. Next, two more examples of oil paintings. And finding beauty on the ground is actually my message. Just look. The one on the right is one of my largest pieces, and one of the ones I'm most pleased with, because it combines a lot of my motivation and messages in one piece. It's pattern, it's color, it's the groundscape, it's indicative of time and transition, of decay and new life. Amongst all that decaying stuff on the ground is a pod, which can sprout something new. And it's a very large piece. So next, this is a more recent piece. I've always enjoyed painting rocks. I think that Scott and I have something in common there in finding interest in rocks and beach subjects. And another example of life coming out of drought. Peter Sheldall, who's the art critic for the New Yorker, made a statement a while ago that kind of validated the way I think, which is that the aesthetic is everywhere, and all you have to do is look for it, and that art concentrates it for convenient consumption. Next. For a while, maybe 25 years ago, I started painting about climate change and drought. And unfortunately, nothing has changed since. But this is one of my my climate change paintings called Going, Going, Gone. And I guess it's redolent of Georgia O'Keeffe in a little way. But, next, there's another one. This was shown in an exhibit I had in Russia called California Surrealism, Lost to Leave. I think the subject's pretty self-evident. Next. These are two more of my climate change series. Life After Man. That's oil on linen. That was published in the LA Times years ago while I was painting it. And then Survivor on the right, which is also self-evident. Next. Having experienced the fires in Santa Barbara, for a while I was influenced by the results of in the atmosphere, the strange skies, the dark browns. This is called Offering to an Impersonal God. It's 4 by 6 feet. It's a combination of still life and landscape and surreal, but definitely influenced by the brown skies at the time. Next. Another one, another surreal landscape with strange light. The foreground and the background aren't meant to be together. It's not, the perspective isn't realism. It's an odd juxtaposition. And this is same as true of these. The one on the right is one of my favorite paintings. It's hanging in my studio right now. It's 4.5 by 7, 6 by 4.5 feet. And it's called Waxing and Waning because like all of my work, it's referring to transition, changing light, the passage of time. And in this case, some of the flowers are waning, others are waxing, and there are buds about to come out. The moon is either waxing or waning, and so is the light. It can be either sunrise or sunset. Next. Then we go on to my kaleidoscopic series, which is something I've always experimented with, even when I was working in pen and ink. But lately, I've been spending more time doing them because it kind of fits in with my spiritual practices. But they're like mandalas, and also because they have cosmic meaning, which is why I've given them cosmic titles. The important thing about these is that they're not digitally derived or assisted. They're all done by hand. I start with one section and I draw that section in, and then I have to trace and flip and trace and flip and trace and flip. I wind up drawing that section about 8 times. And then I have to make sure it all matches up perfectly. Whatever I do in one section, I have to do in the other. So it's a very arduous process. They're all very labor intensive, all rendered by hand. Next. This is the one that's in the show, Efflorescence. And it incorporates my love of pattern along with the kaleidoscopes. It's a mandala of a succulent and the growth pattern. What I should mention is that all my paintings start with a solid red underpainting, and then the images are built up with thin glazes of paint. And often I let the color underneath show through because that adds complexity to the color and gives it shades that wouldn't be achievable otherwise, especially if you're working with green, because green can be very garish, you know. So if you're working on a red underpainting, the complementary color to green, it can modify the garishness. To me, these represent the centrifugal force that drives the universe. Everything is spinning, everything spins. So this too spins. It's a metaphor for it. Okay, next. Here's 2 more. These take a long time to do. This one was called, is called Blue Moon, based on a hydrangea. And the other one is Bougainvillea. And everything is revolving around that central point. Beauty is also really important to me. I don't try to make statements about ugliness. It's very important for me to show beautiful things. Next. 2 more examples. The one on the right is also in the show. To me, I called it wired up because it looks electrical. I put that electrical circle in the middle to show that everything, electricity of the universe is what creates everything. And drainiometry, self-evident. Next. Speaking of spiritual practice, sometimes watching the news and what's going on today with the pandemic and everything in the world, all the news seems bad. This is a series that I do for peace and quiet. I call it my Zen Still Life series. And it's like combing sand or finding peace and just examining the simplest of simple compositions. The Serenity now, these are also quite large. And eucalyptus are two examples of that. But I really find it easy to lose myself on concentrating on something lovely and insignificant. Next. This is paintings like this, my happiest and most beautiful paintings come out of depression for the most part. I'm trying to paint my way out of it. This is in the collection of the Westmont Ridley Tree Museum. It was donated by a collector. It's called Joy Rising. And I painted it when my partner was dying. And I just had to paint my way out of feeling horrible. So that's one example. I have a couple more examples of happy paintings that have pulled me up. Next. Oh, Happy Day. I thought of everything I could throw in there. I know it's over the top, but sometimes you just have to do something beautiful. Next. And this is the latest one, The Lightness of Being. This will be shown at the Open Studios tour coming up on Labor Day weekend. I just had to get this out of my system. The stars, the moon, the sunrise or the sunset, the mountains, the ocean, the flower. It made me very happy. So I guess that's all I have to say about it.
I wanted to share, we had a question come through, Dorothy, about whether your landscapes that appear here are created or if it's a specific mountain range that you're seeing perhaps in Santa Barbara.
They're totally imaginary.
And then Kevin also asked or mentioned, he said that it's been very interesting to watch how people are reacting to Wired Up and efflorescence here at the museum. And they really have the quality that everyone sees a little something different, it seems like, in them.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions? I can't see the Q&A area, so.
We're good on questions for now, so let's move on to Scott and then we'll reconvene on the questions.
Okay, great. And thank you, Dorothy. Your work is so amazing, and I can't imagine the time and effort that you take with each piece. There's truly stunning, and they really do make you think and look at nature differently.
Thank you.
Oh, and there's a little more information about Dorothy, which I'll leave up for a second while I introduce Scott. Scott Chatenever lives and works in Ojai. He creates sculpture, pottery, and custom tiles and has worked in clay for over 20 years. He actually has a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from the University of California in San Diego. And while he was there, he also discovered apparently their craft center where he took a pottery class, and sounds like that's all you need to know. It informed the rest of his life. And with his engineering background, he really is into process and materials and really thinking through things. And he does make his own tools as well, which I think he'll be talking more about. So with that, welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Stacey. And thanks, Dorothy. Beautiful work and fascinating ideas behind that too. Look forward to conversation at the end. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name's Scott Chatenever. Talking to you from my studio in Ojai, California, where I have, well, I'll show you around a little bit. Here's the studio, and out the north. Oh, I should have tested that. around that side is my kilns, and to the west is the barn with the metal shop, the plaster shop, and behind me is wood shop, outdoor kitchen, and brewery. So sort of in the eye of the hurricane here. And for years I would beat myself up over all the distractions, but then one day I just realized, you know, these are all elements of my artistic practice. So, and I hope you'll be able to see a bit of that as we go through my slides. A lot of layers in the art, biology, community, geology, and in this slide you'll see the one on the left references some textile patterns from the kitchen I grew up in, and on the right very disparate work, but that's one of the cups of which I made 100 for years for an annual community Thanksgiving gathering. So community elements in my work too. I work with nonprofits and make some custom work for them to express gratitude to their donors and staff. In the next slide, we'll see an installation shot. And I call this work biological imposters, or sometimes cryptobiology. And the idea behind cryptobiology is just that life forms are connected on so many levels. And there's a cryptobiotic crust in the desert that apparently if you step on it and go off the trail, it sets back the invisible life there. It sets it back 50 years. And that was just fascinating to me, that it was so complex and yet so invisible. So all these ideas sort of push the work to where it is today. But to put that in context, there are some artists I've studied with, or artists that you should know, working in similar vein, if you want to look those up. Richard Notkin was actually a teacher of mine. And I'll talk more about his influence in my work, as well as some artists working in biological abstraction. Bradley Miller, who Dorothy, you'll see he makes some really great rocks. Ah Leon, a Taiwanese artist who makes fake wood, and Ken Price, who made abstract representations that were very biological looking. But the next slide will show how this evolved. And I started out as a potter. Well, as Stacey mentioned, started as an engineer. But when I found out engineers don't get to make things, I found this craft center at UC San Diego. That was over 30 years ago now. And my first teacher, I think, if she figured out how to get on here, is watching today. Her name is Gwen Truax, and she's 92 and still working with clay. So hi, and thank you for getting me started, Gwen, if you're there. I was interested in texture and stamping slabs of texture and then attaching them to these pots, as you see on the left. And at some point, I realized I was more interested in the texture than the pot. And so the image on the right was trying to stick all that texture together without the pot. And around that time, a friend came by my studio and we had a talk, and he asked me just the greatest question, which I still ask students today. And the question was, what do you like most about making this work? Not the result, but what do you like about the process? What do you like about making it? And my answer was the poking. I really loved the feeling of the poking, the rhythm of the poking, the resistance of the clay as the tool penetrated it. And And so then he followed up with asking me, well, what would your work look like if you did just that? And in the next slide, we'll see that the poking sort of takes over. And very quickly, in the previous work, I was poking with a pencil, but very quickly I realized if I'm gonna poke, if I'm gonna make an imprint with something 1,000 times, that's an opportunity to put more information into that impression. So I started thinking about my tools, putting grooves into the pencil and carving different, triangular pieces out of wood dowels, and eventually that evolved into more complex tools that I made out of clay and then in plaster, and we'll see some of that in the next slide. Not to say there's not just a lot of poking by hand, and most of these two pieces were just poking with needle tools, with pencils, with different tools. And Richard Notkin was one to talk about making realistic surfaces, and he talked about variation in scale, being able to make the same imprint or the same impression, but on different scales, because that's the way nature really is. And that idea was confirmed when I, shortly thereafter, reading a book called Chaos by James Glick, which is about systems and ecology and mathematics. And he said that the idea of a fractal is a mathematical term, even though us in the art world know it as a pretty coffee table book. The basic idea, according to the author behind a fractal, is that reality is infinitely complex at all levels of magnification. So you can zoom in or you can zoom out, and you can see one thing better, but the complexity of the other thing goes away, and nothing ever gets simpler. So nature is infinitely complex. And it's interesting, Holly mentioned beauty, and sometimes I don't necessarily think of the things I make as beautiful, but I do think about the idea of beauty. And I think for me, one way that I access beauty is it's the things that make me feel small. And it's the things that are too big to comprehend, the expanses of time that are too long to put in the context of a human lifetime. And so just a thought about beauty for you there, Holly. Anyway, our next slide, we'll see sort of the process I committed to. And a teacher said, commit to a process and put yourself at the mercy of inspiration. And so that's what I've done here by standardizing on sort of this abstract pod-like form, and just using the same tool over and over and seeing how the shapes fit together. And so on the left, we have a tool being used horizontally. On the right, we have a similar tool being used vertically, and just the way those fit together, it changes the nature of things. And in working that way, and we'll see this through the next few slides, we have these variations on a theme. Oh, can we get the next slide? Thanks. So it's this commitment to the process that becomes, in a lot of ways, how nature really works. The title of one of my pieces in the show is Order equals Chaos plus Time. And that's referencing just these unimaginable expanses of time. But biology especially is really just a random number generator. And the good ideas carry on and the bad ideas go away just through time. And so I like working similarly. And as you can see, these have multiplied. I guess I thought these were good ideas at the time. So there's more than one of these, of each of these. And that's just how the patterns fit together. And we'll see a close up in the next slide. that gets into multiple tools. And so the one on the left, I've seen a negative space in between the pattern and found another tool to fit in there and make those deep, darker impressions that are filled with that green glaze. On the right, similar thing, but I carved a diamond shaped tool to fit in between and fill that. So yeah, you can really go down the rabbit hole with this stuff, and I did. Let's see, what's our next slide here? Okay, continuation in the similar vein, but thinking more about edges. And so some of these patterns have an opportunity to say, well, I'll put a hole in here and imply that that texture is something more than it is. So in both of these pieces, there was a lot of care into the placement of the pencil pokes to relate to the pattern. And by putting a hole that's the right size and at the right angle, it adds all sorts of information to that existing pattern and implies that it's hollow, that there's something in it, something moving through it, all kinds of questions that a biologist might ask. Next slide. Another treatment of edges pertaining to fossils is, when we see a fossil, it's not the actual thing. It's nature made a mold of that thing, and then the thing rotted away and the space got filled with water that had some minerals in it, and the minerals solidified in the shape of the thing. And so when you hold a fossil in your hand, you're seeing the result of this complex process that I sometimes duplicate in clay. And so what I've done with this work is created a texture, but then filled in that texture with layers. And in this case, layers of alternating colors, which completely obscures the texture. When it's done being coated with colors, it's completely smooth. But then as I sand back through the layers of color, it erodes in a way that's brings out that information from the texture again. And that's fascinating to watch that happen right before your eyes, duplicating a process that in nature might take millions of years. Next. Couple more of those, we can move on. Next slide. Here we go. Around this point in the development of the work, I was thinking more academically. I was thinking about graduate school and wanting to make some more conceptual elements. So I started thinking about how these imaginary objects might interact with their imaginary landscape. So it is, like Dorothy's work, an organism in the landscape, although clearly different representation of it. And in these next couple of slides, we'll see, you can go on, that kind of begs the question, is the object springing from its landscape, or is the object changing the landscape? This was from a body of work called Shards of Containment. At the time was about genetic engineering, genetically engineered foods. I realized, it's too late to put that genie back in the bottle. Also realized through doing this work that the world didn't change. And so your work can't be based on change, on trying to create change, because when the world doesn't change, I'm not going to quit. I need to find a way to keep making work. So at some point, the work becomes about itself. And the art critic Jerry Saltz recently wrote an article about that on his Instagram feed. That as you go along, the art just becomes about itself. And so it's nice to be at that point. It's nice to be not so committed to the ideas and the abstraction and all that. Next slide, I think we'll see something a little less abstract. For years I was embarrassed to make something that was obvious. I felt like it was less serious. I think maybe the art world felt like it was less serious to sculpt a shell or sculpt a mushroom. And I was having a conversation about that with an artistic cohort, and he said, "But Scott, your work makes people happy." And that was just such a foreign idea to the academic sentiments that I'd been harboring. And I realized I was using abstraction as a crutch to take myself more seriously. And, it's okay to make people happy. So maybe the next slide is more of that. Maybe not. We'll see. Yeah, just liberated to make all kinds of different forms and not worry so much about what it is. But there is this common thread that everybody has a bowl of stuff somewhere in their house, whether it's, ticket stubs from concerts or shells from the beach or whatnot. I think that's the idea of things in a bowl is this universal sentiment that's relatable. So I like the fact that that draws people into this type of work. And I still work with things in a bowl. There's a piece in the show that's things in a bowl. But bowls, it's inescapable that a bowl has a history and a bowl has a function in our society. It's used for food. And so a bowl contains food, a bowl presents your food. And so I'm also fascinated with the way putting things in a bowl begs the question of whether this is safe to eat. And, some of these things look delicious, some of them look scary. And I think engaging the viewer in that process of trying to identify things was one of the things that drew me to abstraction. The inability to classify things combined with its presentation in a bowl really forced some basic human reckoning about, should I eat this? Next slide. So wanted to show a few things. It's not a how-to, but just to elucidate a bit what I mean when I talk about creating the same imprint on different scales. These are a small selection of my scraping tools. And, you might look at those and say, well, they all do the same thing. But, some of them scrape more coarse, some of them scrape more fine, some of them scrape in a direction. And so the combination of all of these really approximates the chaos of the real world. And so I use all these tools together to create that illusion. In the next photo, we'll see some tools I made out of plaster and carved out of clay. And again, on the right, you see the tool and the clay that I'm stamping it into. And the fact that I make these tools tapered means that I can create the same impression on a different scale, depending on how deeply I push it in. And that's getting back to that idea of the fractal. Next slide. So the evolution of these tools is interesting to me because it's the convergence of my work, at least in my imagination, is about evolution, but the tools are also about evolution. So these things are converging in a way. So on the left, you can see there's an original geometry of a tool that I carved. And then by stamping that tool and leaving an impression in clay, I can work with that clay and add information, texture to it. And if I get something I like, then I can pour plaster into that hole in the clay and out comes a new tool that I can use. And that goes on forever and ever. And I can keep doing that. So plaster, you see my little bit of my plaster shop on the right, generally thought of as something that would be used to make pottery in a factory or something that's used to make the same thing over and over. But a lot of artists out there using plaster to make one-of-a-kind things. It's liberating in its ability to to capture your work. So there's a lot of things that I would never spend the hours and hours making them in the first place unless I knew I could capture that work in plaster and reuse it and modify it in the future. So we'll see some examples of that in the next slide.
I wanted to pop in just since you were talking about tools, Scott. Kevin asked if you've ever cut yourself in your tool work and while making, I guess.
Not so much with clay. Clay is incredibly friendly, and I try not to make tools that are too sharp. Occasionally, I'll just wear through the skin from working too much, but mostly when I cut myself, it's kiln building and plumbing, which is the unsung skills of a potter. So yeah, I'll always skin a knuckle when I'm hooking up gas to a kiln. Hope that answers your question, Kevin. So the piece on the left is about 4 feet across, and it's assembled of individually cast elements. There's 3 different shapes there if you look closely. And I sculpted each of those shapes once and made a mold of it. And then using that mold, made multiples. I planned how they would fit together. So that's how I made the thing on the left. The genesis is, now that I have the molds, I can, make one of those shapes and like spend a lot of hours on it again and add all that texture to it. And when I get something I'm happy with, then I make another mold of it. And that becomes the genesis of that work, and a new mold and a new piece. And I rarely use the same mold for the same thing more than once. Not to say I won't use the same mold again, but sometimes I'll use the mold to make another mold. Sometimes when the piece comes out of the mold, as we see in the next picture, I can still do things to it. Next. So you may or may not recognize that shape from the previous mold, but after it came out of the mold, I worked on it some more and bent it and distorted it and created that. So the ability to have, your life's work captured in molds on the shelves at your fingertips is incredibly powerful, and huge opportunity for developing new things. Another example in the next slide, of the molds, this fish panel on the left is a wall piece. It's about 8 by 12. And those were originally individual carvings of fish that I spent hours on because I knew I was going to make a mold. Now, from those molds, I can use that to make a particular fish in clay, and then stretch that clay and sculpt that clay and distort it. And if I get something I like, I can make a new mold of it. So that's where the architectural tiles you see on the right came from. And I can't point at it, but if you look closely, you'll see which fish on the left became some of the fish on the right. So endless possibilities that way. And in fact, I can distort a single fish into maybe 3 or 4 different versions that might not be recognizable as the same one unless you look closely. Next.
We had a clay question. Kevin asked, do you mostly work with leather hard clay?
Well, again, as needed, I'll work from clay in the whole spectrum. So anything from a liquid, which I'll cast liquid clay into molds, all the way up to solid and bone dry, because there's certain things you can't do to clay when it's wet. And it's a fascinating material in that way, and one that's kept my attention for 30 years, and the possibilities are still, I have 3 lifetimes worth of stuff I still want to do in clay. So hope that answers your question. I'll be at the open house if you want to really pick my brain then. So on the left, we have, again, these tiles, but this time adapted into pottery. And so I've come up with a series of flasks that have these fish, a fish on each side. And I like it because it's captured the work of the fish, and it's also created a product that my friends can afford. And I know it's kind of taboo to talk about price point in the art world, maybe less so in the pottery world. But I do think about that, and I do think about who it's for. So I like there to be possibilities for collecting for anybody at any level, whether you're beginning or whether you're a seasoned ceramic art collector. On the right was a mural I just recently completed that was shipped to Florida, and it made the customers very happy. Lots and lots of work by hand on that, but the entire background of small fish behind the big fish was fish that I already had molds for, that I stamped out of the molds. And just using that as a starting point created sort of an underpainting, to use painterly terms. It created depth to it and a lot more of a sense of layers in the work. So that's recent work. And all the wood, that driftwood frame around it, is all made out of clay too. Next slide. So this is my concluding slide, and hope I haven't rambled on. I haven't said everything, but the farther I do get down the rabbit hole, the farther I get in conceptual processes or problem solving, tool making as the need may arise. This feeling of having my hand in clay is always at the forefront, and just such a primal thing. It's such a plastic material that conforms to your gestures, that if I get too far down the rabbit hole, I always come back to just touching clay, because that's where the love in it. That's where the love is for me, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work with clay in all these different ways. So next slide is my Instagram page and contact information. Probably the most up-to-date play-by-play of what I'm doing is my Instagram feed. It's at Chatenever Ceramics. That's where I'll announce sales on my Etsy shop. I think there's some flasks up there right now. And for those interested in collecting, it is valuable to know that the ceramic world is heavily invested in Instagram. So you will find the best of the best there. And believe it or not, they will send you their best work if you say you're a pottery collector or a ceramic art collector. Ceramic artists are really good people. So with that, I'll turn it over to Stacey and Lauren. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. That's so fantastic to get such deep insight into what you do and how you do it, and why. And you can definitely see some parallels in how you both look at the natural world, but kind of in some cases distort it or magnify it, right? Just really fascinating. I'm wondering if either of you have questions for the other. And it's okay if you don't.
Well, I peppered a few responses to Dorothy's talk into mine, and it's nice to know that other artists have gone through that struggle with abstraction, and then really finding what's in it for you and the way that you want to work with it. So that was nice to hear from you, Dorothy. That's not really a question, but thank you for articulating that.
I think your work is so fantastic. I really love it. So, that mural was fabulous. That must have been really heavy.
It sadly cost almost as much to ship as I charged for it.
Right.
I guess I should have charged more, but you know, I did struggle the whole time I was making that with with feeling occasionally like this is not serious work. It's just fish.
I feel the same way about some of my work too, but that's because the art world is so prejudiced against beauty right now.
Yeah, I agree. Even though I have a very much more broad and abstract definition of beauty, I agree.
I did want to pop up with a question that Holly had for both of you. I'll ask Dorothy first, but Holly mentioned, I find there's something deeply satisfying in doing handwork that is repetitious, such as crocheting or knitting, etc. And both of you have elements of that in your work. Do you know why you like to do the repetitious handwork? Do you listen to music or books while you do it?
I guess probably my most happy and creative moments are when I'm listening to my playlist and working on something that takes a lot of concentration. It gets you out of yourself.
Yeah, I also listen to music almost all the time I work. Funny, in hindsight, I've realized before in the past that I have bodies of work that were made in their entirety only listening to the same music. And I did not even realize that at the time. It was just that was the groove I was in. But yeah, the repetition, I mean, there's so much, you know, there's so much calming of the mind that happens with repetition, whether that's walking, whether it's, you know, whirling dervishes, all sorts of spiritual history, you know, the nodding when someone prays. These things are all related and I think speak to just our biology, how we're hardwired to feel a sense of peace. Often I'll listen to jazz because the rhythm of what I'm making, the jazz will help it kind of interrupt it. And so that's the choice of music is interesting, and I'm not completely even aware of my choices. But yeah, that's all in there.
A lot of my drawings were done to Philip Glass and Steve Reich, the minimalists, because it's very hypnotic, takes you on a trip.
See that? I know, I feel like we need to stage a viewing with the music you were listening to according to your works. That would be an interesting
That would be fun.
We got a great question on the chat from Carrie. She wants to know, how many hours a day do each of you work? Do you prefer to sketch and plan everything first? Is there any kind of in the moment stuff that happens as well?
I work all day, every day, but it's not always on clay. And as I touched on in my talk, I gave myself permission to just call that all part of my artistic process. And so, you know, I'll make coffee, I'll go feed the chickens, take a look around the garden, and take it from there. Sometimes I end up in the studio, sometimes I don't. And knowing when an idea is ready is something that I really can't do it on a conscious level. I really had to learn to trust my subconscious. even trust my dreams to sometimes tell me when an idea was ready to start, and also trust myself to forget the bad ideas. And I've had so many experiences with using crutches to remember things. For example, keeping a pot or a sculpture or something around that I don't feel is completely resolved. I'll keep it around to remind me to revisit that. And what I realized over and over was 10 years later, I'll still have the damn thing there, and I'm using it as a crutch to not revisit that. And so more than once I've given that away, and then now there's a sense of urgency to using that idea again before I forget it. So no, I don't sketch. I don't keep a notebook, except for practical things like, who ordered something, or what I need to fill a kiln or whatnot. But as far as creative ideas, I feel like there's a tension. A friend of mine, also a ceramic artist in Santa Barbara, Jim Haggerty, told me once, he said, you should never talk about your ideas, because then you'll feel as though you've accomplished something. And he's right.
Well, I never do sketches. I might think about my idea for a while. It has to cook in my head. But once I know what I want to do, I just go for it on the large scale. And if I work a 4 or 5 hour day, I feel like I've done everything I can possibly do. By the time I'm finished with the 5th hour, I'm just sighing. And I know it's time to quit, because then I start making mistakes.
I'm curious, Dorothy, do you work on, with some of these pieces, they're so large, do you have a ladder? Do you work on a table? What's your preferred way to work?
I usually turn it around. So I have to flip it so that I can reach it. But I don't like to stand on ladders. I can forget.
Neither do I.
Yeah. And a couple follow-ups we have for your process, Dorothy. Carrie asked, how long does it take to make something 6 feet? They're just massive. And I think you already answered this, but she wanted to know if you make any smaller mock-ups before going full scale.
No. The piece that's in the show took me 6 months. The succulent piece, efflorescence, took 6 months. It was COVID time. I had no place to go.
And another question we had a little earlier. We had Sylvia asking Dorothy how you prepare the linen before you begin painting.
How I prepare
the linen.
I already buy pre-gessoed canvases, but then I paint them red. That's how I prepare before I start creating the image. I paint the canvas red. It's kind of like the old master technique. They always did an underpainting, but I like using the red because it adds a lot of complexity to the color.
Yeah, you can certainly see it now that you've said that. I totally see it in efflorescence. It just has a beautiful glow to it with that red that comes through.
Thank you.
And Scott, we had a question for you in the Q&A. Holly wondered, is it hard for you to make a hollow form? She was referring to your first poking example, but I know you have a couple other hollows that were in there.
Hollow. No, not necessarily. I don't know. I've been working with clay so long, I just put the clay where it needs to be. But I never work solid and then whittle the clay out the way like students in a figurative sculpture class will be taught to do. So I'm working with the clay where it needs to be at the thickness I need it to be. I will work quite thickly, thicker than a potter would, because the tools that I'm using to create texture need that depth. And so that gives me the results I need. It thins out a little bit when I stretch it. Most of the pieces are stretched a little bit after they're impressed, but I do have to adjust my firing schedules and fire my kilns a lot more slowly than a potter would, and rarely, if ever, are pottery and sculpture fired together in the same kiln because they have different requirements. While we're on the subject of stretching, do we have time? I prepped an example of some texture, and the one thing that can't really be conveyed in those slides was the movement of the clay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so this is a, where are we? You see that? So this is a slab of clay. You see it's quite thick. And I've poked this with 5 or 6 different tools. You can see different diameters in there. So that's interesting, but it becomes a lot more interesting once I stretch it, and it's hard to see what I'm doing, so bear with me. There we go.
Oh, wow. Oh,
It's magic.
In fact, a lot of this information I'm putting into this clay is not on the surface anymore. It's actually buried and it's overlapped with the clay, but the clay remembers all of that after I put it in, and then when I stretch it, it comes back out. And this variation of thick and thin spots in the clay really makes things natural looking. There's
amazing.
there's that.
Hmm.
Want to see another?
I think so.
That was
Safe to
it.
say, yes.
Yeah. Okay, we'll just do a quick one. You probably recognize this from some of the earlier slides I showed you. There's 2 different one tool textures. We'll just show how that goes.
It's like magic.
There we go, like that.
Mm.
My own magic. And then here, this one's kind of a little tree bark looking.
Wow.
So we can see that.
It's like it's alive when you're doing that.
Yeah, really. I would love to find a way to capture that, but it's difficult, and I don't want to turn into an animator. This one's a really good example of most of the texture being hidden. That just looks like lines, but here's the tool I used for it, and you can see in front of my shirt that edge on there. And so I poke that in this way, and let's see if that comes out when I stretch it.
Huh.
Huh. Okay, interesting. I didn't know it was going to happen there. Haven't done that before. You can see that it didn't stretch evenly because the groove has some different depths to it.
Mm.
Okay, that's enough show and tell for now.
That's amazing.
Thank you
I
for
think
bearing with me.
I wish I
Thank
could
you.
recreate that for our visitors, because they just find it
Mm.
so hard to believe that you're working by hand. And I think that's something so interesting about you both, is you're so detail oriented and in there working with your hands on every last portion, and yet you barely can see any evidence of it. It looks like it's just come right out of the natural world. It's amazing.
Well, thank you guys so much. This was fascinating. I know everybody enjoyed it. I also want to throw out a thank you to our exhibition co-curators. So Nicole Strasberg and Holly Harmon, who brought everybody together and had the connections and knew both of you and knew what you would bring to the show. So excellent job, Holly and Nicole. And so 2 more weeks, if you're watching this live, there's only 2 more weekends. So Labor Day weekend is it. And then next Sunday is when we do our open house. And we hope to have many of you guys here. And it sounds like Scott will be with us for at least part of the afternoon as well. And maybe he'll bring some clay. Maybe, we'll see.
Well, I don't know. Do I get my face painted if I bring clay?
We could do a trade. So thank you both so very much. Just wonderful. And thank all of you for being here, and Laura Noyes for your help with this too. So everybody have a great evening. Thank you.
And we'll get the recording up very soon.
You.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.